Hi, welcome back, class. We're on to chapter 4 of A Mighty Long Way. But before we start the reading, let's go over our homework questions really quickly. And this is a short homework structured notes for you this time. So you still need to provide the gist or what the text is mostly about. And you only have one homework question for chapter 4. On page 66, Carlotta states, "It would be my last night of innocence." What change took place in her view of her life in Little Rock, Arkansas? Let's go ahead to our anchor text. A Mighty Long Way, Chapter 4, Wait and See. Just before Labor Day, my great uncle Emerald Holloway stopped by the house with a surprise gift for me: cash to buy a brand new dress for my first day at Central. Everybody in the family knew that mother was a fastidious seamstress who usually made all of my clothes. But this was no ordinary first day of school, Uncle M said. The integration of the finest high school in Arkansas will happen just once in our lifetime, and I had to have a dress to match the occasion. Even one of mother's perfectly tailored creations would not do. I had to have a store bought dress. Mother and I took the bus downtown and searched our favorite department stores until we found the perfect outfit: a black skirt set with small bluish green letters and small and numbers spread in a random pattern. The blouse had short sleeves, just right for the hot and humid early days of September. The skirt was pleated at the waist with enough fabric to flow over my crinoline slip. The outfit looked sophisticated and smart, not too dainty. I wasn't a dainty kind of girl. I hung the skirt set in my closet to wait for the big day, September 3rd, the Tuesday after Labor Day. Labor Day marked the end of summer vacation, and my family spent the afternoon at Gilliam Park. The pool was the main draw, and it was always so full of people that you could barely swim a clear path from one side to the other. Page 64. My family cooked hot dogs and hamburgers on a cast iron pit in the grassy picnic area. Between pool breaks, the teenagers danced to the rhythm and blues and rock and roll blaring from the intercom. About midday, I heard a rumor that Governor Favas would appear on late night television news to make a speech about Central, but I was having too much fun to give it much thought. Later that afternoon, though, I checked the newspapers, the Arkansas Gazette, the morning paper that we received daily at home, and the Arkansas Democrat, the afternoon paper that we sometimes picked up from the newsstand. Neither of them had any information about the speech. My parents didn't seem worried. They liked Favas. They had voted for him twice before in previous elections. He was a man of the people, I'd heard them say, and unlike his past opponents, he was not a strident segregationist. He certainly was no John Patterson, the Alabama governor who had banned the NAACP from operating in his state and welcomed the support of the Ku Klux Klan. And neither was Faubus a Marvin Griffin, the brash Georgia governor who promised to keep the schools in his state segregated, come hell or high water. Three small school districts in rural Arkansas already had been integrated peacefully in the previous 2 years with little notice. Fathers had even refused to intervene when white residents in one of the towns, Hoxie, a community with fewer than 2,000 residents in northern Arkansas, protested the desegregation of their schools and asked the state to step in. My parents had no clue that fathers had made an about face and was moments away from announcing a bold move that would help to write Little Rock's civil rights history. I had paid little attention to recent news coverage and was unaware that fathers had spent much of the summer cavorting with groups of well-known segregationists. In late August, when the Mothers League filed a temporary injunction in Pulaski County Chancery Court to halt the integration of Central indefinitely, Favas even testified as a surprise witness. He upheld the group's claims that their parents were afraid to send their children to school for fear of widespread violence. He said guns and knives had been confiscated from Little Rock students. The injunction was granted, but days later, a federal district court judge nullified it when the NAACP sent two of its best attorneys, Wiley Branton, to a homegrown lawyer who had been involved with the successful integration of the University of Arkansas's law school in 1948, and Thurgood Marshall, the rising star who had argued the Brown case before the U.S. Supreme Court. As my family gathered at 10 p.m. in front of the television in the den to watch Fathers, none of us expected any earth shattering news. This was my bedtime, and quite frankly, I was just eager to get some sleep so that I could be well rested for the big day ahead. About 15 minutes after the hour, Fabius appeared on screen. Like Blossom, he was a big man. He wore a dark suit and tie and spoke with a southern drawl, typical of white politicians of his ilk. I listened as he droned on the first few minutes about the history of race relations in Arkansas. But at age 14, I was a busybody who found it hard to sit still for long periods, especially during rambling speeches. I was about to start daydreaming when the governor said something that caught my attention. Governor Favis said, now that a federal court has ruled that no further litigation is possible before the forcible integration of N words in whites in Central High School tomorrow, the evidence of discord, anger, and resentment has come to me from so many sources as to become a deluge. There is evidence of disorder and threats of disorder which could have but one inevitable result, that is, violence which can lead to injury and the doing of harm to persons and property. I could hardly believe my ears. Were white men and women in Little Rock really so angry about black students attending Central that they were willing to harm us? I just wanted to go to school and get the best possible education. What was so wrong with that? The thought that people were threatening violence at first made me more angry than afraid, but I found an odd sense of comfort in what Father said next. Units of the National Guard have been or are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of the community. Advanced units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School. I have informed Chief Lindsay, director of the Arkansas State Police, of the developments, and he is now mobilizing a force to act as an arm of the state militia in maintaining or restoring the peace and order of the community, and to act in every way possible to protect the lives and property of the citizens of Pulaski County. I knew I was a citizen of Pulaski County. My parents paid taxes. They were citizens too. I honestly believe that I was included in those whom our government had deployed the Arkansas National Guard to protect. It was shocking to think that a military unit might be necessary to keep the peace on my first day at Central, but I still wanted to go. Somehow, I had gotten it into my head that Central was crucial to my future. I knew that if I could make it there, a school ranked among the top 40 in the nation, I could make it anywhere. Things would settle down eventually. Once the rabble rousers realized theirs was a lost cause, I figured. In the meantime, the National Guard would keep me safe, or so I thought. I must have been too caught up in my own thoughts to pay much attention to the last part of the father's speech, the part calling for a delay in integrating Central. When I closed my eyes that night, I was confident that I would be at Central the next day and that I would be safe. It would be my last night of confidence. Let's go back to that homework question where Carlotta says it would be my last night of innocence. Let me go back here. Exactly. She says it would be my last night of innocence. What does Carlotta mean by this? After listening to Governor Faber's speech, she went to sleep thinking that she's going to be confident and safe in the morning, but this would be her last night of innocence. Think about that and make sure you give a thoughtful, provoking answer here and even provide some evidence to better support your claim and what you believe. Let's go back. We're at the top of page 67. The next morning, I woke up to the news that the opening of the school was delayed. Mrs. Bates had called my parents while I was sleeping with the word that the school board was asking the black students to stay home until further notice. With the disruptive presence of the National Guard at Faubus's call for a delay, the board wanted to seek further legal resolution. My new dress would have to wait. I'd pinned so much of my hope and excitement on this day. Now, all I could do was wait and wonder. It was beyond frustrating. The day seemed to drag with little information from the adults involved. Daddy went to work, as usual, and Mother spent much of the time on the telephone answering questions from concerned relatives and friends. She also checked in with Mrs. Bates for updates. The neighborhood was dead still. Most of my friends returned to Man that day, so I couldn't even talk to them on the telephone. The legal matter was resolved by early afternoon. U.S. District Court Judge Ronald Davies, the magistrate who had nullified the initial injunction, ordered the school system to proceed the next day with integration at Central. He said he was not swayed by the sentiments of the segregationists. I have a constitutional duty and obligation from which I shall not shrink, he said. Later that afternoon, Superintendent Blossom called a last-minute meeting with as many parents he could could attend and instructed them to send their children to Central the next day alone. The presence of the parents might incite even more trouble at the school, he told them. My parents could have decided right then the risk was too high and withdrawn me from Central. I'm grateful that they did not. Instead, they remained calm and resolute. In a rare magazine interview, Daddy later explained to Gazette reporter why he didn't back down. Only one thought ever crossed my mind about the whole thing. She had a right to go there. My tax money is not separated from the rest of the tax money. There was no reason for her to pass one high school to go to another. Daddy believed we were doing the right thing. He and Mother were among the youngest of the black parents sending their children to Central, and they deeply respected the leadership of Mrs. Bates and the other parents involved, particularly Mrs. Green, Ernie's mother, my first grade teacher. If Central was safe enough for Mrs. Green's son, they figured, then surely it was safe enough for me. After the meeting with Blossom, Mrs. Bates gave us the good news. School was back on for the next day. Besides Ernie and Gloria, I still wasn't sure who would join me at Central. Several students had changed their minds when they first heard from Blossom that they would have to give up all of their extracurricular activities. I'd just have to wait and see. Sometime after midnight, Mrs. Bates called again to tell my parents to drop me off at 8:30 a.m. at the 13th and Park Streets, about a block from the school. An interracial group of ministers would meet us there to escort us to school, she said. We wouldn't have to walk alone. The next morning, September 4th, I popped out of bed without hesitation. It was really going to happen, I thought. The anticipation of walking up those regal steps into Central made each moment seem to tick by slowly. Questions filled my head. Who else would be there from Dunbar and Man? What would the teachers be like? What about the students? Would I make new friends? Was I ready to compete with them academically? How long would it take me to learn my way around that huge campus? Finally, it was time to go. Mother and I climbed into the car shortly after 8 a.m. and headed down 14th Street to Velmer to 13th and cruised toward Park. We noticed a small group of students and two black ministers whom Mother recognized gathering near the intersection. This was the meeting spot, and Mother pulled to a stop. She looked relieved when she saw Reverend. One second. She looked relieved when she saw Reverend Harry Bass, who had been my pastor at White Memorial. He now served as a pastor of Wesley Chapel Methodist Church on the campus of Philander Smith. It was one of Little Rock's largest black Methodist churches and where the Cohen side of my family attended. Mother also knew the other black minister who was there, Reverend ZZ Driver, the father of one of my friends at Dunbar. She trusted these men, and I'm sure it comforted her to leave me in such good hands. Three older white ministers and a young white man, none of whom I knew, were there too. I said goodbye to Mother, hopped out of the car, and made my way over to the group. As I walked toward them, I saw Ernie, Gloria, and another student I recognized, Jefferson Thomas. a fellow sophomore who had been president of the student council at Dunbar the previous year. I had worked closely with him as vice president, so I knew him pretty well. There were three other students I didn't know, but I learned their names pretty quickly: Thelma Mothershed, Minnie Jean Brown, and Jane Hill, a tall, quiet girl who seemed a bit more uncomfortable than the rest. We chatted anxiously until one of the ministers approached and said it was time to get moving. But first, he said we needed to pray. We formed a tight circle and bowed our heads as the Reverend asked God to walk with us, strengthen, and protect us. Then the adults put us in formation. Out front were the four white men: Reverend Dunbar Oden Jr., president of the Greater Little Rock Ministerial Association, his 21-year-old son, David, Reverend Will Campbell of the Nashville based National Council of Churches, and Reverend George Chauncey of First Presbyterian Church in Monticello, a small town in southern Arkansas. The students lined up by twos in the middle. Reverends Bass and Driver held up the rear. Now it was time to go. Slowly and silently, our group began moving in tandem up Park Street toward the school. I could hear the rumble of a crowd up ahead. It was loud, like a Dunbar football game size crowd. I clutched my notebook and moved with the group through sticky through the sticky September air. With every step, the hooting and hollering grew louder. As we got closer to 14th Street, I glanced toward the mobile gas station on the other side of the street, and for the first time I saw it, a mob of people that stretched as far as I could see. The sheer size of the crowd was shocking. There must have been hundreds of people: white mothers with faces contorted in anger, white fathers pumping their fists in the air and shouting, white teenagers and children waving Confederate flags and mimicking their parents. Just who were these people? Were they the women who turned up their noses and mumbled nasty words at Mother and me on the city bus? Were they the white customers I saw from time to time with Big Daddy at the meat packing houses downtown? Sorry, guys, 1 second. Carlotta's trying to figure out these aren't the same white people from my neighborhood. She goes on to say, were they my white neighbors? The scene felt surreal, with everyone screaming and jeering at once. Their words sounded muddled except for one word: N word, N word, N word. It shot out of angry mouths like bullets and pierced my ears again and again. Adrenaline pulsed through my body and quickened the pace of my heart. But I wasn't afraid. The mob was too far away to stop me from getting inside. The front entrance of the school was now in sight, and the military was just steps ahead. I was more perplexed than anything else. I had never seen such raw anger up close before, and this was directed at me for what? Because I wanted to go to school? I turned away and remembered Mother's and Daddy's words. There's just ignorant, low class people. They're just trying to scare you. Don't stoop to their level. You are walls. Just take the next step and the next. Finally, we were staring into the faces of the Arkansas National Guard. The guardsmen had formed a ring around the school. They blocked the entrance, but I was certain that when they saw us, they would just step aside and allow us through. They were, after all, there to protect us and keep out the troublemakers, I thought, but not one of them budged. Instead, the commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marion Johnson, whose name I was to discover later, stepped forward. Commander Johnson assumed Reverend Oden was our leader and began addressing him. The rest of us gathered closely around. I stood to the side of Johnson, who had both hands clutched unnaturally tight around a billy club. His knuckles looked white. Ernie, pressing his lips together nervously, stood beside me. That put him almost face to face with the officer. Gloria stood behind me, and behind her, Jane towered over all of us. Johnson told Reverend Oden that on the orders of fathers, we would not be permitted to enter the school. The commander's words stunned me. There was a huge disconnect in my head. The guardsmen weren't there to protect us, they were there to keep us out. As the message washed over me, I thought, "You got to be kidding." Ernie, the only senior among us, spoke up. "You're not going to let us in? Is that what you're telling us?" The officer repeated his order for us to leave. His men stood resolutely in formation, still blocking us out, their rifles slung across their chests. Our group stood there for a moment, not quite sure what to do. And then the ministers turned and led us silently away. The mob continued yelling in the distance, but this time I barely heard any of it. I was completely stunned. I'd never missed a day of school in my life. I still could not believe that I was standing just steps from the schoolhouse door, wanting desperately just to go to class. And the powers that be wouldn't let me in. The highest court in the land had said I had a right to be at that school to learn, just like the white children. What would it take to open those closed ears and change their hardened hearts? For the rest of the day, I felt out of sync, isolated. I kept thinking that all of my good friends were in school where I should have been. But as bad as I felt, nothing could compare with the sorrow that came over me when I clicked on the television news that evening and saw in black and white what had happened to Elizabeth Eckford, a junior who was supposed to be with our group that day. I didn't know Elizabeth personally, but as was common in the black community, our families knew each other. She and some of her siblings had attended Stevens Elementary, and her father periodically worked for one of my great uncles. Her grandfather also owned a neighborhood grocery store just across the street from Big Daddy's pool hall and cafe. But the Eckfords didn't have a telephone, and as Mrs. Bates later described in her memoir, Elizabeth didn't get the word about our meeting place. Mrs. Bates had intended to try to reach her that morning, and in the hurried pace of the day, she just forgot. Unfortunately, Elizabeth walked right into the mob, which surrounded and terrorized her. There she was on my television screen, walking silently and alone in her crisp black and white dress. Her face looked solemn, and she wore dark sunglasses, which I'm sure must have hidden her tears. She was followed by some of the same angry men, women, and children I had seen from a distance earlier that day, but they were right on Elizabeth, shouting at her, spitting at her, clawing at her, not the least bit concerned that television cameras were capturing it all for eternity. That iconic image of Elizabeth surrounded by the mob will circle the globe and outrage the world. The next day, the New York Times would run this account of the moment when a lone white woman, Grace Lorch, whose husband taught at Philander Smith College, came to Elizabeth's aid. A N-word girl sat on a bench. She seemed in a state of shock. A white woman, Mrs. Grace Lorch, walked over to comfort her. "What are you doing, you N-word lover?" Mrs. Lorch was asked. You stay away from that girl. She's scared," Mrs. Lorch said. "She's just a little girl." She appealed to the men and women around her. Page 73. "Why don't you calm down?" she asked. "I'm not here to fight with you. 6 months from now, you'll be ashamed of what you're doing. Go home. You're just one of them," Mrs. Lorch was told. She escorted the N-word student to the other side of the street, but the crowd followed. "Won't somebody please call a taxi?" she pleaded. She was met with hoop calls and jeers. Finally, after being jostled by the crowd, she worked her way to the street corner, and the two boarded a bus. Two others who were supposed to be part of the group, Melba Patillo and Terrence Roberts, both juniors, also walked separately into the mob that morning, but each of them managed to slip away. I didn't know Melba, but Terrence had been president of the student council at Dunbar while I was vice president in my 8th grade year. That would have been 10 black students who showed up with intentions to enter Central. But after that morning, Jane Hill, the tall, quiet girl who had made that first terrible walk with us, never returned. That left 9 of us. None of us had any idea how long it would be before we were allowed to go to school. One day turned into 2 days, which turned into a week and then another. When I wasn't at home, the 9 of us often could be found at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Bates. The couple lived on West 28th Street in a middle class neighborhood that was a that was a collage of small wooden brick houses. The Bates home was a yellowish brick ranch model with a large picture window facing the street. To the national civil rights leaders who came to town to assist in the case and the reporters who covered it, the house on West 28th Street became the unofficial headquarters for the 9 of us trying to enter Central. We were interviewed there, we met politicians there, and we heard words of encouragement and lectures about the importance of our mission there. It became our home away from home, and Mr. and Mrs. Bates were our trusted guardians. Mr. Bates was tall and lean with a narrow face, deep brown skin, and short gray hair. He was much older than his wife, grandfatherly to me, very low key, gentle, and reassuring. While he was a longtime activist who used his newspaper to advocate for civil rights, it was Mrs. Bates who rose to the limelight. She wouldn't be caught anywhere without being perfectly made up, head to toe, but pity the man who mistook her ladylike ways as a sign of weakness. She was tough to the core, with razor sharp edges, and she demanded respect. Her obligation to the treatment she received from an attorney for the Little Rock School Board during a court hearing in a separate case a year earlier had made front page news. The NAACP was in court in 1956 attempting to force the school board to speed up its plans to desegregate. But during questioning, Mrs. Bates stopped the attorney in his tracks. "You addressed me several times this morning by my first name," she told him. "That is something that is reserved for my intimate friends and my husband. You will refrain from calling me Daisy." The attorney retorted, "I won't call you anything then." Mrs. Bates shot back, "That's fine." The next morning, all of the Little Rock read about the gutsy NAACP president in a front page story in the Gazette. Over the weeks, over the weeks that my cohorts and I were out of school, Mrs. Bates became our point person, the one who arranged media interviews and often the one who spoke for us. She was ahead of her time as far as the media was concerned. She was naturally at ease under the glow of television lights and quick to fire off the perfect quote. I didn't understand then how necessary the media was to the greater good the 9 of us had been anointed to carry out. I was just one who never liked a whole lot of hoopla. So from the start, I was uncomfortable with the constant throng of people always around us, asking questions, taking pictures. No matter the time of day or night, it seemed somebody was always at the Bates' house. Journalists, politicians, NAACP field workers. Sometimes the guests bunked in the couple's basement. Sometimes they even stayed next door at the home of Dr. Garman Freeman, a dentist who was also married to a dentist. Theirs was an entire community of like minded people. Dr. Lee Lorch, head of the math department at Philander Smith, and his wife Grace, the white woman who had helped lead Elizabeth to safety on September 4th, lived just across the street. When I could, I'd slip away from them all, find a quiet corner somewhere, pull out my books, and at least try to look busy, a tactic I began using to deflect attention. When the 9 of us were together as a group, I tried to be inconspicuous and just fade into the background. I never liked the feeling of being on display. I think Mrs. Bates eventually came to understand that about me and just let me be. I always I always appreciated that about her, and I've come to understand and appreciate her even more now that I'm older. She took a lot of the heat off our parents. They weren't hounded by the press and got to stay mostly in the background. For that leadership, she was already paying a heavy price, threatening telephone calls every day, a cross burned in her yard, and a rock slammed through her picture window in the middle of the night with a message that promised dynamite the next time. And the nine of us hadn't even made it inside the school yet. After the first week of our missing classes, Mrs. Bates arranged for our teachers at Central to send homework packets containing our schoolwork so that we could at least make a valiant effort to keep up with our classmates. I saw my schedule for the first time when I received a homework packet. I was enrolled in English, geometry, biology, Spanish, gym, and speech. The Lorches pulled together a group of Philander Smith professors and other teachers to tutor us and help with our schoolwork. Dr. Lorch was particularly helpful to me because I struggled with geometry, which seemed so different from algebra. I occasionally took the bus to Philander Smith in the afternoon or evening when he was available to work with me. When I finished my schoolwork, I turned it in to Mrs. Bates, who arranged to get it to our teachers. What happened to it after that, I don't know. I wouldn't have been able to keep up without the help of Dr. Lorch and the other tutors. But I missed going to school. I missed the daily interaction with teachers, the give and take in the classroom that sometimes helped the textbooks make sense. I wondered how long it would be before I got to meet the teachers face to face and whether they would resent my presence as much as the mob that continued to gather each morning outside the school. I grew more and more anxious that I was falling behind in school, especially since no one seemed to have any idea how long the wait would be. I think all nine of us felt that way. Clusters of us had known one another before our fates thrust us together. But during all of those meetings and meals at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Bates, the nine of us began getting to know one another as friends, On television, we often heard ourselves referred to as the Nine or the Little Rock Nine, in the same way that people sometimes identify twins as if they have no separate identities. But we were growing more comfortable around one another, and I was starting to get a real sense of the distinct personalities. Ernie was the oldest, cool headed and serious. His status as the lone senior seemed to catapult him into the position of our leader. He was usually the one Mrs. Bates and the press grabbed to speak for the group. Melba and Minnie Jean were the gregarious ones, both outgoing and outspoken. They were also good friends, singers, and quite comfortable in front of the cameras. Terry was a young intellectual who was always at the top of his class, but he also had a fun side, a dry, witty sense of humor that kept me in stitches. We're at the top of page 77. Elizabeth seemed painfully shy. She had expressive doe eyes that seemed to reveal a hint of sadness. She could barely even make eye contact when she spoke. There was a sweet innocence about her and an easy, trusting nature. Thelma was quiet, too, but she seemed the most fragile among us. Aside from being physically small, just about 5 feet tall and less than 100 pounds, she had a heart condition that made everybody want to protect her. Jefferson was a sophomore, like me, and everyone's pampered baby brother, a bit naive, but athletic and smart. He was always joking around and somehow seemed to find humor in even the most serious situations. He also loved music and had an unbelievably large and varied record collection. Gloria was the other sophomore. She was mature and dignified, petite and dainty. She also had what most teenagers envied, her own car. I had a December birthday, which made me the youngest of the bunch. But from the time I was a little girl, people always said that something about me seemed old. Maybe it's my way with all kinds of people. I don't know. But I got along well with everybody. And in the days ahead, I would be called in to referee when some of the personalities began to collide. Mrs. Bates understood the anxiety the nine of us felt about being out of school, and she tried her best each day to assure us that things would be resolved soon. Thurgood Marshall was coming to town to represent us, she said. That really excited me. He was already high on my list of heroes, even before successfully presenting the Brown case to in the Supreme Court, he had argued a case in Little Rock that involved my uncle Byron Johnson. He was among a group of black teachers at Dunbar who had demanded equal pay with the white teachers in the 1940s. The NAACP and Marshall took on the Little Rock School Board in that case and won. I knew we were in good hands. Judging from what I was reading in the newspapers, we would need some of Marshall's status to battle our hard headed governor. By now, I was reading the newspaper practically every day. The adults involved were spare with the details when they talked about the case at all, but the local newspapers and the black press helped me keep up with what was going on. I followed the legal wrangling, which seemed nonstop. Just 3 days after the National Guard blocked our entry into Central, the school board was back in court asking for a suspension of its own desegregation plan. Davies took just 4 minutes to refuse the request. His message was clear: integrate now. Then, following up on an investigation ordered by Davies, the U.S. Justice Department filed a petition asking the court to force the governor to remove the National Guard and comply with the desegregation order. The department's investigation had found no credence to the governor's claims that he called out the National Guard to keep the peace based on evidence that violence would erupt at Central if black students were admitted. The investigation determined that Faves had acted purely as a segregationist with the sole purpose of keeping out the black students. Davies scheduled the courtroom shutdown on that matter for September 20th. Meanwhile, it was hard to miss the political maneuvering too. Thurgood Marshall and others had begun urging President Eisenhower to get involved. Initially reluctant, the president responded to a telegram from Faves objecting to the extreme stand from the federal court. The two men decided to meet at Eisenhower's summer home in Rhode Island on September 14th. The 9 of us happened to be meeting with Mrs. Bates at her home that day when we saw a television report about the meeting. We gathered around the television in the basement and watched as Faves and Eisenhower emerged from the meeting smiling. The men shook hands for the cameras. I sighed with relief. It appeared that a favorable agreement had been reached. With excitement, I pronounced to the group. We're at the top of page 79. And now we'll go to school on Monday. But Mrs. Bates quickly shot back, well, not so fast. Experience has taught her caution. As it turned out, she was right. Despite Eisenhower's declaration that the two had engaged in a constructive discussion, the men had reached no agreement. Nothing changed. We'd have to wait nearly another week for a September 20 court hearing. I had never been inside a courtroom until that day. My friend Bunny, who was home from the private school she attended in North Carolina, went along to offer her support. I didn't know what to expect, and as we walked inside, I could feel my palms getting sweaty. The courtroom was still, dark, and quiet. I could almost hear myself breathe. I took a seat near the front. When the judge entered, he sat behind a large mahogany desk before us. He was small and serious, but my eyes stayed mostly on Mr. Marshall. Bunny and I were mesmerized by this attorney who had the swagger and aura of a movie star. I had never seen a black professional with more confidence. Here was a black man striding up and down this courtroom with the certainty that this was where he belonged. Tall and thin with closely cropped black hair, he was as handsome as he was smart. And he did not tread lightly. I suppose I have been conditioned to expect diplomacy, perhaps even difference, from a black lawyer practicing in a room full of white people. It was the Southern way. But not this man. He spoke my mind, and he did so unapologetically, indignantly. He commanded respect, and respect is what he got, especially from Judge Davies. I added Judge Davies to my list of civil rights heroes that day, too. He treated Marshall with the respect he deserved, a respect that might not have been as forthcoming if one of the white Southern judges had been presiding. Davies was destined, it seemed, to become a part of this chapter in history. Eisenhower had appointed him to the federal bench in North Dakota 2 years earlier, and Davies was dispatched to Little Rock on temporary assignment in August 1957. One of the first cases to hit his desk will become the most high profile and significant in his career. In stature, Davies stood barely 5 feet tall, but he was fearless and unfailingly fair in the face of segregationists willing to try just about anything to have their way. Faubus and his attorneys even questioned whether Davies had the proper authority to preside over the school desegregation case since his jurisdiction was North Dakota. But Davies rejected their challenge and kept right on moving. Like Marshall, the judge didn't mince words. In one of the earlier hearings, he told Faubus, "The testimony and arguments this morning were, in my judgment, as anemic as the petition itself. In an organized society, there can be nothing but ultimate confusion and chaos if court decrees are flouted, whatever the pretext." Faubus didn't attend the September 20 hearing. Instead, he sent his attorneys. But they soon grew frustrated after Davies overruled them several times. Before the hearing was over, they gathered their papers and announced that they were leaving. It caused quite a buzz in the courtroom. Judge Davies slapped his gavel on the desk. "The hearing will continue," he said. "I was so proud of Ernie and Elizabeth, who were called to testify. They answered questions thoughtfully and articulately about why they wanted to attend Central and what happened when we had tried to enter on September 4th. And, of course, Mr. Marshall did not disappoint. He gave a rousing closing argument. In one simple but powerful moment, he turned and pointed at Ernie, Minnie, and me, shook his head full of righteous indignation, and said, 'These young people should be in school.' Judge Davies didn't take long to render his decision. The National Guard had to go. Faubus could no longer use the troops to block our entrance into Central. With that, Davies banged his gavel once more and court was adjourned. The room was filled with supporters who filed quietly out of the courtroom, but I was absolutely jubilant. I'd just seen everything I learned about the Constitution, the judicial process, and justice came to life. Justice had been served. I assumed that meant our ordeal was finally over. I turned to Mrs. Bates and said, "This means we can go to school?" Her caution again caught me off guard. "We'll see," she responded, not sounding excited at all. I was disappointed. I didn't understand her lack of enthusiasm. That night, Faubus went on a statewide radio broadcast and announced that he was withdrawing the troops from Central in the compliance with the federal order. He lambasted Davies in the Department of Justice. He also took one more swipe at the NAACP. He urged the group to back off of its integration plans in favor of a voluntary cooling off period, and he threatened the possibility of bloodshed. I went to bed that night feeling completely deflated. The weekend was yet ahead. Anything could happen. Bunny was headed back to school in North Carolina. The National Guard was gone, and the governor was peddling fear. After what I seen of that mob outside Central, I couldn't be sure that this threat wasn't real. I had no idea whether my parents were thinking that too. Outdoors, a storm raged, casting a gloomy pall over the entire city. The weather was mimicking my mood. The big day was set for Monday, September 23rd, but a world of doubt lay between this moment and that one. Mrs. Bates was right. I just have to wait and see. And that's the end of chapter 4.